Welcome everyone, Christine here with my Dwarf tier list for Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. So for campaign purposes on Legendary difficulty. And there's a couple of things worth mentioning about this tier list. Cost is going to matter, tier availability is going to matter, how well units work together within an army, upkeep is obviously going to matter. So all these things are going to play a very important role. It's not just about which unit is the best, right? Because then we could, just put Thunder Barges at S tier and that's done, right? Everything else is below that. But that's not really how units work with regards to the campaign in Warhammer 3. Because a Thunder Barge is a very high tier unit that's also very expensive. So how useful a unit is from a practical standpoint in a campaign, especially when it matters. The current meta of Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires, regardless of the difficulty you're playing on, is certainly focused on the early game more so than the late game. You also got to consider, even in the late game, is it useful to make a really powerful army, or more useful to make a bunch of armies to spread around the entire campaign map to deal with various issues as your empire grows? And that is something that I do very much take into account. So anyway, starting with regular Slayers, I'm going to put them as an F tier unit. There's almost no situation in which recruiting regular Dwarf Slayers is worth it. Great Cellar Slayers, yes, that's a different discussion, but this list is not about like those special units or regiments right now or anything like that. It's just about the generic units. So I don't see a reason to recruit regular Dwarf Slayers. One, you have Slayer Pirates at the same tier. Two, in terms of their combat ability, they're actually not that great. Regular Dwarf Warriors will generally perform better because they're far more durable and they can break. And that's actually a very important point. Units being unbreakable can be very important in certain situations, sure, if they have an enormous amount of combat ability. But in a campaign situation, you also want to keep your units alive as well. That is an important factor. So units breaking, routing, if they have high leadership, of course, and dwarves do have high leadership, units routing when they're about to die actually helps preserve your units in a campaign. So for Slayers, that their unbreakable aspect is not really as much of a benefit from my perspective. But then we have Giant Slayers, and Giant Slayers are a very different discussion. In general, with Slayers, you would want a Demon Slayer leading a Slayer army for all the benefits they can provide, or Ungram. But Giant Slayers are your principal infantry option to deal with large units. They're a really solid unit for that particular role. It is more of a niche role, and you do have other options like range units, artillery, flying units. You do have options of dealing with large units. But if you want to form a solid front line, then one of the things you're going to have to deal with are large units, cavalry charges, monstrous units. Those are things that do matter in a campaign. And Giant Slayers are really the only great choice for dwarves that are melee, to be clear. Range, very different discussion. But in terms of melee, these guys do get the job done. They're very effective at that job. And they're worth recruiting far more so than regular Slayers. Sure, they can be a bit annoying to recruit, tier requirements, cost, etc. So that is one of the reasons they're not higher on this list. But for what they are, fairly solid unit. Then we have Slayer Pirates. Not the best combat unit in a lot of ways, but a solid enough hybrid melee unit. Certainly worth recruiting far more than regular Slayers. See, if I'm recruiting Slayers in a campaign, unless I'm making a full-on Slayer army, I might recruit a couple of Slayers to have a kind of specialist role in an army. And that's what Slayer Pirates do. Like, Giant Slayers are good against anti-large. What are Slayer Pirates good for? Skirmishing. Harassing the enemy. Like, they won't break. Like, you can charge them and they'll just stand still. That's actually a pretty significant benefit. And they can do a decent amount of damage through range. Not great damage, but they do have that kind of specialist role that I do want from a unit like this. Then we have Doomseekers. I think Doomseekers are a C tier unit. Their combat ability is pretty good. That's not the problem. But the tier requirements, the recruitment duration, and the thing about dwarves is if you are dealing with a bunch of chaff, you have plenty of options, much better options, much easier options to recruit than Doomseekers. I don't really think that Doomseekers are worth recruiting all that much. Like, the recruitment duration certainly is something that is playing a role against them very significantly over here. Obviously, they also take a lot of damage. All Slayers can take a lot of damage, but the problem with them is it takes them a while to use their special ability. So you kind of have to micromanage them, protect them. And I personally just don't see a role for them all that much. Malachi starts with them, and I barely use them with his army. And recruiting them is like just, for the fun factor. They do have a role as chaff killers, but there's plenty of units that can fill that role within a dwarven army. Then we have Goblin hewers, F tier unit. Like, the only thing these things are good at is like doing a bunch of damage to a single unit, and then just engaging with an artillery in melee, or rather the slayers that are crewing the goblin hewer engaging in melee. So they're kind of more useful than regular slayers in that respect, but still not a really great unit to use. Even with Malachi's campaign upgrades, and keep in mind, I'm not considering just Malachi's campaign over here. Like, that would look very different as a tier list, to be sure. But for general purposes, I don't think Goblin Hewers are really worth it as a unit. Very, very niche unit. Very limited situations in which you'd want to bother with one of these. Can be annoying to kill, to be sure, and they can do a good amount of damage, but it is limited damage. And I think having a unit that can do a lot of damage and sustain that damage far more is generally going to be far more useful. Then we have Thunderers, both versions. So we have the Grudge Rakers, and then we have the regular Thunderers. Both of them are A tier units. Solid amount of range damage. One is more close range and more capable of dealing with large clumps of enemies. Another one is more focused on single targets, but both of them are good at their jobs. Just really solid range units that do get the job done. Very easily available, both of them. I mean, sure, Grudge Rakers do require tier 3, Thunderers require tier 2, but the building you get them from is a building that you're probably going to want to construct anyway. This is another thing to point out. You do have limited ability slots. You can't always get everything, right? And by the time you do get everything, the campaign is, done. But Thunderers come from a building which you would want for other things as well. Like, if they weren't coming from that building, maybe I would put them lower tier, but they are coming from a building that you would want for other reasons. They are very useful. They do provide a solid ranged front line for your army. Like, they're pretty solid in melee. They're very good in range. They do have some terrain limitations and all that, so that is a bit of an issue for them. But as far as gunpowder units go in Warhammer 3, these guys are freaking fantastic. Easily available from a building that you'd want to get anyway. Not expensive, fast to recruit. There's a lot of reasons to get Thunderers in pretty much every single Dwarven army. Which is not the same you can say for Rangers. Like, Rangers are the poor man's crossbow. I understand that they're supposed to have, kind of like a skirmisher reason, but here's the thing about Rangers. If you want to make a Ranger skirmisher army, regular Rangers are just not worth it. Like, compared to the other Ranger options that you do have. So why would you bother with regular Rangers when at the same tier that you can recruit them, there's much better options available to recruit? And at higher tiers, there's, again, much better units to recruit, including better Rangers. Then we have the one with gray weapons. I'm going to put that as D tier. Solid in melee with a precursor weapon, so they can do some damage, but really they're mainly a melee unit. A bit of hybrid unit. Solid enough melee unit, just not really that special from my perspective. And one of the problems with Rangers is that you do have Bugman's Rangers available. Bugman's Rangers, in as far as Rangers go, are the only real Ranger unit that's actually worth recruiting in a campaign. It is more of a specialist role. You can say the same about Slayers, to be sure. So not necessarily a general purpose unit, and you kind of have to build an army around using them. Belegar in particular does very well with them, even if you confederate Belegar. But you do have various benefits with, like, Thanes, with Belegar, various things that do make Bugman's Rangers in particular work as a ranged unit, sneaky, stealthy, skirmisher unit, really, really solid in the role that it has. And compared to regular rangers or the ones with gray weapons, these guys can be worth recruiting as far as you want to actually recruit ranger units in a campaign. Then we have bolt throwers, F tier unit. The problem with bolt throwers is not so much that they're a bad unit. Contrary to belief on that subject, bolt throwers for what they are solid enough, right? But the problem is dwarves have much better artillery options at the same tier that you can recruit bolt throwers. They're an artillery option dedicated to dealing with artillery. And that is not really necessarily a problem in the dwarf campaign, dealing with enemy artillery. You have plenty of options to deal with enemy artillery. And so there's almost no reason to recruit regular bolt throwers in a dwarf campaign in Warhammer 3. Then we have grudge throwers. So grudge throwers are a solid artillery unit, but at the tier you can recruit them, which is tier 2, you may not actually want to bother with artillery in general. Like, if you want artillery, solid enough option. Like, everything above D tier is worth recruiting in a certain situation. You know, depends on the situation you're dealing with. If you just want artillery, grudge throwers do get the job done. But I would say that given the way things work right now and the units you have available at tier 2, it is not necessarily worth investing your money and building slots in terms of getting grudge throwers. The only reason you'd get this building at tier 2, actually there is no reason to get the artillery building in a dwarf campaign at tier 2. It is, however, worth getting it at tier 3. See, that's where things change. Like, is a building worth getting at a specific tier that a unit is available? In the case of artillery, not necessarily so much. At tier 3, however, you get more building slots, you have more options, and that's when you can get cannons. And cannons are an A tier unit. Yeah, certainly the gunpowder units, like Forik with grudge throwers, very different situation, but that's the exception, not the rule. Cannons are pretty much better in every single way than grudge throwers. They're only a tier higher. Dwarf growth is pretty solid at the moment in the game. You have plenty of benefits with that. You have research that gives you a lot of growth surplus points. And essentially the way I see Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires campaign, any unit that's at most tier 3 is a unit that you will probably recruit generally in a campaign. It's units that require higher than tier 3, so tier 4, tier 5 units, that where you kind of run into issues on whether or not it's worth recruiting. But cannons, yeah, really good against walls, good on the battlefield. Not necessarily as good in certain specialist roles, like grudge throwers might be a bit better if they land. Keep in mind, if their projectiles land against clumps of units. Bolt throwers might be better against artillery, but as a general purpose artillery unit, cannons do get the job done. Then you have organ guns, higher tier requirement to be sure, but geez, do these things pack a hell of a punch? You might argue about the tier requirements, but I honestly can say that in every single dwarf campaign, the moment I can get organ guns, I want to get organ guns. The amount of difference that they make in individual battles is significant. The amount of power that they add in a battlefield is not something to avoid. Like, these hurt. They hurt a lot. They're not that expensive. And yes, they do require higher tier, so that is annoying. But I think as far as higher tier units go, organ guns are actually one of the good options, because you can play a campaign just fine without them, but the moment you can get them, there's no reason not to get them. The cost is not prohibitive. The tier is not that crazy in terms of a requirement. You may not have them in every single army, but if you can get them, go for it. It's worth it pretty much all the time. Flame cannons, kind of the tier unit, like just a grudge settler flame cannons. Again, different discussion between grudge settlers and regular units. Flame cannons, very, very niche role, and you have a bunch of flaming options available otherwise. So if you're looking for flame damage, flame cannons, I don't think they're worth it. Really, like, I would rather have regular cannons than flame cannons. Between the tier requirement, I'd rather have, and between the tier requirement of these two units, I'd rather have regular cannons. Or if I'm at tier 4, I would rather have organ guns. Like, let me play. At tier 3, I'm obviously going to get cannons. At tier 4, between flame cannons and organ guns, I'm going to go organ guns. And there's another option. Like, if I'm looking for a unit to do a certain amount of damage against specific targets, there are many other options at that particular point. Then there's thunder barges. Now, as far as a lot of people are concerned, this is the ultimate overpowered unit in the campaign. I don't agree. As far as I see it, I'm going to piss off a lot of people who are going to be like, what the hell are you thinking? Here's what I'm going to say. I think Thunder Barges are a D tier unit. I certainly wouldn't put them in F tier. Here's the problem I have with Thunder Barges. They're ridiculously expensive. They're a tier 5 unit. By the time you can even recruit them, with the exception of the ones that Malachi gets for free in his campaign, you've won your campaign. And at that point in a or you're at the point in a campaign where you're actually better off recruiting multiple units for the same cost as a Thunder Barge. A Thunder Barge is a very niche specialist unit that you do not need in any Dwarven campaign. Even the Thunder Barges Malachi gets for free, they are not important in his campaign. There are units he has far more available, that are far easier to recruit, far cheaper, that can do a great job in a campaign. Because it's not just like, oh, how powerful is an individual unit? Well, dwarves have really powerful individual units that can get the job done, and you got to consider that you might be running in a campaign with those units far earlier than you can even recruit the Thunder Barge, so unit experience comes into play as well. Don't ignore that aspect. Unit experience does matter. So yes, a Thunder Barge might make a difference here and there, but very, very niche role, I would say, during the course of a regular campaign in Warhammer 3. Getting to tier 5 takes a long time. By the time you get it, you're probably in a position where you have pretty solid armies already. If you're playing the game as you should be playing it, you have pretty strong, solid armies. You might replace 1 or 2 units in those armies for the sake of Thunder Barge, but is it necessary? Not really. Is it cost effective? Not really. Do you need it to win the campaign? No. Does it add more power than you already have? It can add more power, but do you need that power? Unless you're dealing with endgame crises, and even then, again, I would rather have more armies of weaker units, cheaper units. Like, for a cost of a Thunder Barge or a Thunder Barge stack, I can have 3-4 stacks of units. I'll tell you this much, given the way battles play out in Warhammer 3, 3-4 stacks is going to do a lot more than a single stack of Thunder Barges. For Malachi, it's a different affair. Again, different situation. You can argue about war machines in general in Malachi. Then we have gyrocopters. I'll get to gyro bombers in just a second. Gyrocopters are an S tier unit. Here's the thing. Flying range units are incredibly powerful, and the game clearly is not designed to handle them properly. Gyrocopters are very easily available, very easy to recruit, very easy to maintain, and they pack a hell of a punch. They have bombs that they drop. They have a couple of bombs. They do a decent amount of damage. They're very fast, very difficult to take down for the AI, with the exception of like flying units. Thunder Barges are actually kind of more vulnerable than gyrocopters, because gyrocopters can outrun most things. Thunder Barges will not outrun most things. That's an aspect. Like, you end up being targeted by artillery with gyrocopters or range units, run the hell away. Run in circles around the enemy. You can do that, out-damage them, and kill them. And the amount of speed benefits, ammunition benefits, damage benefits you get from engineers, dwarf engineers, is absurdly ridiculous. Gyrocopters are one of the best dwarf units to recruit in a campaign. And same with brimstone guns, higher tier, sure, but you know what these guys are? Flying flamethrowers. You know how Skaven have a ridiculous amount of power because they have tier 2 flamethrowers? You have tier 3 flying flamethrowers. They are absurd. They break morale, they do a lot of damage, they have flaming attacks. This unit is the reason you don't care about flame cannons in a campaign. I'm not joking on that. And then if you want a big punchy flying unit, gyro bombers, S tier unit as well. Tier 4, but much faster to recruit, more readily available in a campaign, have a significant number of upgrades, can do a significant amount of damage, drop so many bombs on enemy. Like, the sheer amount of bombs that a single gyro bomber can carry is absurdly freaking ridiculous. I'm not worried about freaking Thunder Barges. Like, the one unit I actually want to recruit in Dwarf campaigns, the one unit I'm aiming to recruit when I'm playing a Dwarf campaign is not Thunder Barges, it's Gyro Bombers. Gyro Bomber stacks are far more cost effective, far more readily available, in a lot of ways far better, because they're much faster. They do a truckload of damage themselves with their single attack. Like, in one campaign, I went up against like 20. I don't even remember. Like, there was a ridiculous amount of Skaven armies, but obviously only 4 at one time. And I had the gyro bomber stack. As Malachi, granted, the sheer amount of damage these things do with their regular attack is ridiculous. The sheer amount of damage they do with their bombs is ridiculous. And here's one advantage. They're not single entities, but but one of the problems gyrocopters can have is there's a lot of entities per units, and there's some pathfinding issues that exist in the game. I'm sure plenty of people who have played Dwarfs have encountered this. But gyro bombers, there's few enough of them in a single unit that the pathfinding issues are not as prevalent. And they have a lot more flexibility and tactical usage than a Thunder Barge does. And they're a lot freaking cheaper as well. And they're not a tier 5 unit. So yeah, gyrocopters worth recruiting, Thunder Barges not necessarily worth recruiting, or very niche situation. Like, I don't see a situation in a campaign where I would want a Thunder Barge if I have a gyro bomber. That's where I stand. And that's not considering Malachi's situation. That's just considering regular usage. Hammers, B tier unit, solid enough line infantry, especially for foreground, really solid line infantry in terms of damage dealing. It's more of an anti-infantry unit than anything else. They're pretty scary, though. Pretty scary, and foreground character very high-ranking hammers in his campaign. Can be a bit costly, so that's one of the problems. More of a niche situation with them, because like the real power of the dwarves comes from range units, artillery, and flying units. But as far as infantry goes, really good unit. Then we have Iron Breakers, also really good infantry unit. Actually, I would probably put them as A tier. Like, they do a lot of AoE damage. They're exceptional line holders. Like, you put a line of Iron Breakers, they will not break easily. Like, these are really good line holders, not slayers. These guys. You throw these guys in a melee situation, they will hold. And if they do break, they'll break with such low HP that you want them to break at that point. But by the time they do break, they will have left a lot of the enemy behind them. Then we have Iron Drakes, S tier unit. Sure, gyrocopters with brimstone guns have a lot of flexibility that Iron Drakes don't have. But as far as a unit goes that's static, like these guys obliterate enemy formations. Like, when you're in a siege situation, you put these guys at the gates, open gates, or wall breaks, and you just watch them annihilate units. It's very easy to get a lot of freaking kills without much management with Iron Drakes. It depends on how you manage your formation. Can be vulnerable to range, can be vulnerable to melee, all that. So that is a downside, I would say, with regards to them. But phenomenal unit for what it is, and it's a tier 2 unit. Like, if it wasn't for the tier requirement, I would probably put them in A tier. Because obviously, you know, gyrocopters with brimstone guns are better. But they are a tier 2 unit. That is freaking phenomenal. Like, very easy to recruit. That structure you get Thunderers from, you don't get that structure for Thunderers. You get it for Iron Drakes. They are absurdly good, very cost effective. You won't mass armies of them. But 2 of these guys do the work of the rest of the army combined. That is ridiculously good. And then we have Trollhammer Torpedoes, higher tier unit. More of a specialist role as opposed to kind of like a general purpose, if you will. Like, Iron Drakes are more useful in more situations, but like, yeah, Trollhammer Torpedoes are also absurdly good. The Rush Seller unit, which is a gyrocopter with a Trollhammer Torpedo, let's just say there's a reason that thing is scary as hell. Yeah, it's not quite the same weapon, to be sure, but it's still a really, really good unit. That I would dare say. Then we have Longbeards. I probably would put Longbeards in C tier. They're good line holders. They get the job done, but it's kind of not worth bothering with them. Like, your regular Dwarf Warriors are pretty good line holders, and if you want a higher tier unit, you got Iron Breakers available. So they get the job done. There's nothing wrong with them. There's nothing broken about them. They're available. They're not expensive or anything like that, but kind of a bit redundant as far as I see it. Then we have Longbeards with dual weapons. As far as with two-handed weapons, go, like, I'd rather have hammers. I'd rather have giant slayers. Or if I need that armor piercing, there's many other ways of getting as dwarves. So I don't really see a point in getting longbeards with great weapons. Also, stupidly enough, dot resolve actually causes them to take more damage. I'm not sure why exactly, but it does. It counts shield. Like, this is the ridiculous aspect of odd resolve. It counts shields. Even in situations where we're dealing with opponents that don't have ranged weaponry, it still counts them. Regular miners, F tier unit. Like, you can the only reason you ever recruit miners in a campaign is you don't have a recruitment structure and you just want to fill up an army. That is it. There's no reason to recruit miners in a dwarf campaign. The sheer amount of available units, even at tier 1, like, just might bear. There's many units you can recruit in a dwarf campaign, even at tier 1. So regular miners not worth it. Miners with blasting charges, though, that's a B tier unit. Not quite higher than that, so it's got some limitations, but they're basically miners with a ranged precursor attack that can do a truckload of damage if used correctly. It requires a bit of micro, can blast your own unit, so be careful about that. But yeah, these guys, they're so strong right now that people in the multiplayer community want the damage on the explosion to be nerfed because it's doing a bit too much damage. Quarrelers. Well, I would say quarrelers are a C tier unit. Nothing wrong with them. You can use them to fill up armies. You don't necessarily want to get too many thunderers or iron drakes in our army. So quarrelers, both great weapons and shielded version, they fill the purpose of, they are a good filler unit in armies. Like, when I'm playing a dwarf campaign, I want to get iron drakes, I want to get thunderers, I want to get gyrocopters, and if I want other units as well, especially early on, I get quarrelers. If I have the barracks for it, which I probably want to get because of the Thanes. But that's the purpose of quarrelers. Not a bad unit whatsoever, worth recruiting, but yeah, just not necessarily as much incentive as others. Then we have Dwarf Warriors. I think Dwarf Warriors are a solid A tier unit. Tier 1 unit, very solid line holders, get the job done. Very useful to recruit if you're looking for a melee unit. Like longbeards, yeah, you have to go out of your way to get them and you have to justify it. There's no reason to justify getting Dwarf Warriors. Like, some would argue like miners with blasting charges are worth it more. The damage certainly is, but you have plenty of ways of getting damage as well in Dwarf campaign. And tier 1 is not, like, tier 2 is where really it's at. Like, with the exception of Forgrim, who starts with tier 1 settlement and then gets a tier 2, and really tier 1 only applies to Scarsnake, and yeah, get Dwarf Warriors for that. Outside of that, I personally prefer getting more Dwarf Warriors and miners with blasting charges in my campaigns. And Dwarf Warriors with great weapons can be a good armor-piercing option, to be sure. Easily available, very cheap, same tier as regular Dwarf Warriors. But, you know, if you're for melee, for early game Dwarf melee, I would say you want more durability than you want damage dealing. So I personally consider regular Dwarf Warriors as being more relevant than Dwarf Warriors with great weapons. But that's where I stand with regards to the Dwarf tier list. I'm sure plenty of people will disagree, especially because of this one unit. Like, ooh, don't you think Thunder Barges are overpowered? No. I'm talking about purely a campaign dynamic here, not a multiplayer dynamic. I'm not talking about multiplayer balance or anything like that. I'm talking about Immortal Empires. That's the purpose of this video. And for Immortal Empires, I just can't really justify ever recruiting a Thunder Barge unless it's a very, very specific situation. But that's where I stand on it with regards to the generic dwarf units in Total War Warhammer for Immortal Empires. Christine signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. Stay tuned for more.